Okay, let's get into Deciphering Japan. The last episode of Deciphering Japan. I think so. I think it's the last one. Yeah, it is. It's the last episode of Deciphering Japan, episode 4. This one is not so controversial. It is, but it isn't. I'm gonna do this one out of order because okay, no, I won't. I'll just go through it in the order. Like I took my notes in the order that it is. But especially the first part of it, I'm not going to put too much detail in because it branches off into the final topic I want to talk about in this episode. So the first episode, this episode really, the first topic that they talk about is kind of kawaii and the concept of kawaii, and it's set in the Kawaii Monster Hotel in the Kawaii Monster Cafe in Harajuku, which you've probably heard me say that my mentor, my friend, is in the restaurant industry, and I remember he told me, he sent me pictures from the Kawaii Monster Cafe because he went to the opening, and he was just like, you know how much money they spent building this motherfucker, and he just kind of broke down to me like the price, and he was like, this shit, fuck, like, basically, saying like the business model for it is kind of fucked, basically, and there's no way they're gonna recoup the amount of money that the company spent making this place. But he had fun running around the place, before they opened like several years ago. They I'm going to talk in a bit about the concept of kawaii and how I feel like it's been kind of skewed, especially for foreign people. So I'm going to hold off on that, but definitely just know there is a huge difference between the everyday concept of kawaii and what kawaii means outside of Japan, right? Completely fucking night and day. Like the shit that Japanophiles living outside of Japan think kawaii is fucking weird to me. Like, I'm like, what the fuck are y'all looking at? I mean, it's not wrong, but it's not, what's the word? It's not normal? For lack of a better word, not normal, but it's not standard. It's not like, okay. If you ask, like I said, like someone who's really into Japan, I'll just call you a Japanophile for lack of a better word, a Japanophile from another country, what is kawaii? And you ask like an everyday Japanese person, what is kawaii? You'll get completely different answers. Generally speaking, completely different answers. And what I think is misleading is like the Kawaii Cafe, the Kawaii Monster Cafe and Kari Pamu and Harajuku outside of Japan is kind of the generally accepted image of what kawaii is, but it really isn't. That's what it's thought to be. Let me make sure this is recording. Hold on. Okay, yeah, and that is, I think, a very not dangerous is too much of a too overly dramatic, melodramatic word, but it's a misleading thing, right? It's a very misleading thing, and it's economically good. It sells tickets, it sells, it gets butts in the seats. It gets people on airplanes to come to Japan, and it gets people to go to expos, and it's fun, right? It's fantasy, but it's not the core of what kawaii is in Japan. It's just not, right? And that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit later. So hold on for that. Later on in the episode, they talk about half Japanese people, mixed people. You've kind of heard me talk about this, about me, my son, my personal experience as well, my thoughts on this. So I don't really have too much to add to that, like in this episode, but I do want you to know that for me, one important thing to understand about the people in this episode is that they're talking from the fashion industry, right? And as you can probably imagine, the fashion industry is a very completely different industry than everyday life in Japan. What they're saying is, I'm not trying to invalidate what they're saying. It's true, but some of their opinions and views trying to break into the fashion industry as a half Japanese person, I think that's where you get, the kind of white is right kind of thing, and which I agree with them on, like, as far as that industry goes. But trying to go the mainstream, high fashion route, for example, that's kind of what you're going to encounter. And I think that's not only true in Japan, that's true like not so much recently, because, urban culture has kind of become the cash cow for high fashion, right? Or let's say not knockoff is too much of a condescending way of saying it, but the finally the acknowledgement, not acceptance, but the acknowledgement of the influence of urban culture has become the cash cow of high fashion, right? Yeah, so in a sense, like high fashion has become a lot more inclusive than it was, let's say, like 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But there is still that kind of hierarchy, if you will. I'm sure even if you're not into fashion, you can feel it and you know it exists. So the same thing, even more intensified, is true in Japan, because again, things that are established trends outside of Japan are even more intensified when they come into Japan, right? So just take that with a grain of salt. I don't really have too much else to add to that. The nationalist thing, like, for me, it's interesting because, yeah, like right wingers are a thing here. It's again, I'm not going to get too deep into the dynamic because it's a lot deeper than I can say. Again, I'm an outsider here, so I can't really get too deep into it myself. But I do think that it's interesting that a lot of the right wingers overtly say things that in some form or another exist in Japan unknowingly, right? Like, right wingers are saying we don't want foreign people here, like, especially the people here, like, we don't want foreign people here. And Japanese people generally don't think like that on the surface. But at the same time, like, Japanese people might start to feel uncomfortable if there are too many foreign people moving into their neighborhood, right? Or if there are too many tourists, or like if they feel like the Japaneseness is being drained away from their everyday life. That might make them uncomfortable. And I mean, naturally so. I'm not blaming them at all, but living in Japan is kind of like, that's one of the conundrums of this country. It's like, you have to really, that self-awareness of some of the hangups that Japanese people have isn't really there. People aren't really aware of the fact that they are kind of, people are aware that they're island country and an island civilization. You'll hear Japanese people acknowledge that very much so, but the willingness to acknowledging that that's your hang up and being willing to let go of that hang up are two completely different things. A lot of Japanese people are very much aware that, hey, we're an island nation, we're isolated, this is us, but okay, yeah, so are you gonna change this shit? That's a completely different conversation that people get really uncomfortable about. So for me, of course, like, right wingers like that, they very much are fringe, even a lot more so than, for example, in America. Even just look, not only what the guy says, look at like the footage of their like rally or whatever the fuck it was. It's like a old dude and someone walking their dog, just looking at them all crazy from the station. That's pretty much what you see. in the Tokyo area. I don't know about other areas. I don't know about the countryside, but that's pretty much what you see. The same reaction that you get. It's like, oh, okay, whatever. And again, generally speaking, like making a ruckus, disturbing the peace is something that's looked negatively upon, regardless of what the fuck you're saying. So, yeah, but for me, the hang-ups that Japanese society does have about foreign people that go unsaid, unspoken, unrecognized is something that I would like to see brought to the forefront and discussed, and not only discussed but actually resolved, in a more inclusive way. I don't know what that way is because I'm on the outside looking in. And that's something that kind of is in-house business that needs to be handled by Japanese people. I don't know how they would resolve that at all, but it's something that I'd like to see done at some point in the future. Oh yeah, can the parents of mixed kids in Ibaraki? I don't really have that much to add to that. Besides the fact that for me, watching that family, they look like a happy family. But for me, looking at the kids are very much being raised as Japanese. To me, is kind of what it feels like. It seems like if I look at those kids, like I would imagine 80, maybe 90% they're Japanese versus like taking on the characteristics of the dad. And again, it is a very tricky thing. Like my son, so far he's only 3, but he's like straddling that line very well because he's getting 200% of those things, and I'm very proud watching him switch between people, between cultures, between languages, between his atmosphere, and I mean finding his way so far. It's still very early in the game, but I'm happy the way he's playing in the first quarter. When he hits elementary school, it's gonna be a different thing. I gotta keep tabs on it even more so. But because they live in Ibaraki, because they're so far outside, which is kind of the countryside, I'm curious to know how much African culture, how much Black culture is in those kids beyond what they look like. Is kind of, and for me that's kind of a big thing. Because I mean I believe this is only my theory that without the proper acknowledgement, recognition, and education of a young kid who's mixed, especially growing up in Japan, I can't speak to everyone else. You're taught to believe like you're like everyone else, you're Japanese, but it's clear it's like one of these things doesn't belong. Not in a negative way, but it's like look, okay, you got what, pale skin, dark skin. Like it's not rocket science. So if you tell the kids aren't stupid. Like if you tell a kid or treat them the same as everyone else, even if on the surface you do, they know they're different from everyone else. It does, there is a double consciousness kind of thing that goes on that people I think don't recognize and don't acknowledge. But so like even if like you want them to be like everyone else, you treat them like everyone else, they know they're different. And the older that they get, the more they're going to understand that. And those questions are going to start to eat up at them because it's like, am I the only one that's crazy that sees like I look different from the rest of you? It's like, it sounds kind of negative. I keep using like the ugly duckling. It's like, I know I'm different from you guys. So, being able to, from the jump, tell my son, you're different. It's fine, but you're different, and, this is why, and it's not a bad thing. It's actually a very good thing. And you have other responsibilities and things you need to be aware of because of it. That's all. Deal with it. You'll be all right. It's not a big deal. You don't need to be like, oh my god, like no, like but and whatever the challenges come, I hope as a parent I'm equipped to handle it and make my son, go through whatever difficulties he might have with a sense of pride, a sense of self-confidence to be able to not avoid any of those issues but to overcome them. So that's my only concern about that type of situation. So I don't know. Take it as what you will. Handicapped people in Japan. I can't really speak on this too much, but yeah, Japan. I've talked about before. Japan is not anything outside of the ordinary. Japanese society kind of not necessarily shuns, but shies away from. On all levels, right? So that's another issue that I think is needs to be addressed in Japan to be more inclusive. That's kind of all I can really say about that. The last thing I want to say is the Buddhist monk with bars and bands and stuff like that. I'm not gonna lie, I kind of skipped forward a little bit. I realized I didn't watch that final part. And I just wasn't really. I just looked at it. I was like, okay, but but it might seem cool. Well, Buddhist monk has like a bar and things like that. For me, like again, Japan is not a religious country. Like traditions, ceremonies play a very important part of everyday life here. But Japanese people aren't generally that religious. Like there are Christians here, there are a lot of other religions, but on average, your average person is not going to be religious at all. I've heard lots of people even challenge the fact whether there is a God, might be atheists. Not necessarily like they have a hardline stance against God, but just like people are so focused on their everyday life here. Anything beyond that kind of gets pushed to the periphery, or even like, I don't even really think that, it doesn't matter, or I can't really see that happening. Faith in the unknown isn't really something that's a strong motivator in the everyday lives of Japanese people. It just isn't. So even though you have people who might, what's the word? Might do on be involved highly with a lot of religious ceremonies, it doesn't really have a spiritual meaning to, I would say, the majority of people actively participating in them. Rituals, ceremonies are, history, tradition, very much strongly ingrained in Japan. The importance of religion, not so much, And so that part of the reason why I skipped through that is because seeing that monk have his bar, for me, maybe he might not see it as that, but for me, his customers, it's just a theme. It's just another, go to like, I'm not equating the two together, but, go to a hostess bar, go to a titty bar, and go to the Buddhist bar. It's like another exciting new theme to go there for. That's all it is, to attract people. Same thing with the band. They're not like, religion. They're just like, okay, this is something, a subculture, a theme, for lack of a better word, gimmick, a hook to get people in, and I would be kind of skeptical as to the ability to actually meaningfully get those patrons interested in their religion, versus like, in the West, especially in Christianity, I'll say, that's a thing where you can kind of hook in young people with music. You can hook in young people, not with bars, but like maybe with like music or some other shit, is the kind of the hook that you see religions use to get kind of young people to participate and become active in. But in Japan, I think it's just like a way to get kind of butts in the seats and keep the business going, is what I'd say. To be honest with you, it's really not that deep. But in general, I think that wraps up Deciphering Japan. Again, for me, a great series. I kind of gave a critique of it, my perspective on it, but by no means don't let those critiques downplay how entertaining and how informative I thought that docu-series was and is. And if you're only watching this video or listening to this, I definitely encourage you to watch the whole thing, give it likes, give it props. It definitely gets my boom stamp of approval. I just wanted you to also take a different perspective going into it as well, so that you can also extract, I think, the most meaningful core information from that as possible.